All right, good morning and welcome to Backyard Naturalist. Today we're going to be talking about salamanders, but as always, want to say thank you to our subscribers. And you too can become a Backyard Naturalist subscriber. A subscription gets you a link sent to your inbox for our weekly lectures every Friday morning, as well as a subscriber appreciation party. And if you become a super subscriber, you also get access to our monthly field trip series, Green Spaces, Familiar Faces, which we have a few upcoming trips. Next Saturday, uh, April 5th, we'll be joined by Chuck Hagner. He'll be taking us to a spot along the Milwaukee River early in the morning at 7 to 8:30 a.m. To look for his favorite fox sparrows. And then later in the month, on April 26th, another morning field trip. We'll be going to Haven Woods with local BIPOC Birding Club of Wisconsin leader Rita Flores Wiskowski. If you're a super subscriber, you're already signed up, but individual trips are $20, or you can sign up for the whole series for $110. And last call for people who want to see prairie chickens. We're going next week, Wednesday and Thursday, to get up super early and watch the prairie chickens dance on their lek. We still have space in this trip if you would like to join us. We'll plug a couple more programs. Next week on April 3rd is also the start of the land management care for the land series. They'll be starting with native gardening in small spaces. And then, of course, the return of the Brew City Birding Festival, May 9th through 18th. Visit Milwaukee is presenting this year, so we have lots of partners joining, putting on events all throughout the city. But we'll encourage you to join our events, particularly our Green Birding Challenge, our 13th annual eco-friendly birding challenge on May 10th, World Migratory Bird Day, for the first time ever at Washington Park. But getting into salamanders, there are tons and tons of salamanders all over the world. They're amphibians of the order Urodelia. They have a lizard-like appearance, but they're more closely being amphibians related to frogs and toads. They lack scales just like frogs and toads, and have permeable skin like frogs and toads. There are 10 families in this order, and they can range in size from like the 29 species of minute salamanders, which are about 1 1/8 inch long, or about 27 millimeters, the size of a peso, or to the 6 species of giant salamander, like this eastern hellbender, which can grow to 12 to 29 inches, which makes it the largest salamander in North America, or its cousin, the Chinese giant salamander, which can reach up to 6 feet in length and is the largest living salamander species in the world. There are more than 760 living species of salamander. And what's super cool about them is how they're globally distributed. In a lot of species, species richness typically looks something like this, where the number of observed species is highest around the equator, where there's a very warm and stable climate. But with salamanders, they are most diverse in Appalachia, so in the eastern US. The US has roughly half of the worldwide salamander species. And why this is all because of this one salamander family, Plethodontidae. This is the most speciose salamander family of the 10 families. This is a family of tiny lungless salamanders. There are over 500 species just in this family, including the eastern redback salamander and the four-toed salamander, which can be seen in some parts of Wisconsin. Because they're lungless, they respirate through their skin and the tissues lining their mouth. Um, so because of this, they need to remain in areas that are fairly cool and moist. And due to this method of respiration, um, they don't get a lot of oxygen as any animal with lungs would get just by breathing air. And because of their small body size, they don't really need a whole lot. So it kind of works out for them. But because of their small size, they also don't travel very far. Additionally, due to the structure of the Appalachian Mountains, there are a lot of ridges and valleys, which is plenty to separate populations of very tiny salamanders with little tiny legs. Plus, they mostly eat springtails, which are very, very small, way too small for most other terrestrial vertebrates, leaving them with minimal competition. And so because of all this, the topology, their small size, what they eat, the lack of competition, all of this allowed for intense speciation of this family, creating an abundance of species in the US in particular, including some of these species, mostly the top ones. In fact, we are observing this further speciation of this family in real time. Encentina schultzii is a species complex of plethodontid salamanders on the west coast. And they're described as what's known in ecology as a ring species. A ring species is a connected series of neighboring populations around a geographic barrier. So like a lake or a mountain or valley, where each closely sited population, so populations that are pretty much adjacent to each other, can interbreed, and they do. But at the end of this ring, when the circle rejoins, there exists at least two end populations that are now too distantly related to interbreed. And so with these salamanders, the ancestral population, starting from way, way north in California and Oregon, dispersed south along around the Central Valley of California. So on either side. The Central Valley is an area where the climate can vary a lot between seasons, much more so than along the coast of California or along the Sierra Nevada range. But now where the populations meet in Southern California, they have no ability to interbreed, while all these neighboring populations are still able to. But enough about plethodontids. We'll get back to salamanders more generally. Generally speaking, salamanders, as I said earlier, have a lizard-like body plan, but they're distinct in their lack of scales as well as their lack of claws. Salamanders also have possible grooves along their sides. These are thought to help channel water over the surface of their body, which helps them retain moisture since they have that permeable skin. Like frogs and toads, their life cycle includes an aquatic stage where they metamorphize into a more recognizable adult. Larval salamanders have gills, which are typically lost as they grow and age. Most go on to live a terrestrial life, but some species remain fully aquatic. Some species that retain their gills go through a process called neoteny. This is the delaying or the slowing of physiological development of an organism. In salamanders in particular, this means that they will retain their larval traits and never metamorphose into that recognizable terrestrial adult. While certain species are more likely to remain neotenic throughout their life, like this axolotl, neoteny has been observed in all of the salamander families and may potentially be universally possible, regardless of the species. Um, for species that aren't fully neotenic, they might retain their juvenile traits for long periods of time, which would allow them to survive when terrestrial environments are too harsh, like when it's too cold or if it's too dry, um, or if there's not enough food available, so they can remain in this aquatic stage for longer. Some salamanders that spend their entire life living aquatically are, as mentioned earlier, the axolotl. Uh, all of the 6 species of giant salamander, like the hellbender and the Chinese giant salamander, mud puppies, and the eyeless Texas blind salamander, which is a cave-dwelling species, as well as the groups sirens and amphibious, otherwise known as Congo eels, although they're not found in the Congo, but rather the southeastern US. Um, these two groups never grow hind limbs, so it gives them an eel-like appearance, and they'll spend their life mostly aquatically. And though they have external gills, these gills are pretty inefficient when sirens in particular become adults. So they primarily breathe through lungs, very well developed lungs. They primarily breathe air while they retain a fully aquatic lifestyle. But because of their lungs, they're able to cross land, particularly when conditions are rainy and moist. So they can exit the water and move somewhere else. Besides spending their juvenile um, period of life or their entire life in the water, many salamanders will breed in water. They'll migrate to their breeding grounds on warm, rainy nights, usually in early spring, so right around this time of year. Their breeding grounds are often the streams or the ponds in which they were born. Um, so they'll make long journeys. Newts in particular go through pretty significant changes while they make this journey. Their skin is much rougher than other salamanders, which allows them to retain moisture um, while they're living terrestrially. However, as they journey to their natal ponds, their skin smooths and their tail flattens, making them more equipped for an aquatic life while they are in their breeding season. After mating, females will lay gelatinous masses of eggs, sometimes in the water, but sometimes on land. And most of our lungless salamanders, our plethodontids, will actually give live birth to little miniature versions of themselves. But groups that will lay eggs terrestrially as well, and typically when they do so, they will guard those eggs. Several different species of salamanders exhibit, it started raining really hard, parental care, where one of the parents will typically guard the eggs until they hatch. They'll rotate them, protect them from infection, predation, um, things like that. Terrestrial salamanders, like relatively moist and cool environments, as long as they're not too cold. There are no salamanders north of the Arctic tree line. All salamanders are opportunistic predators. They aren't very fast. So they'll feed on whatever they can get. Other things that are slow, whatever they come across. This includes snails, shrimp, worms, mites, spiders, other insects. Um, Again, pretty much whatever they can find. Because of their soft, squishy bodies and slow speed, they don't have a lot of anti-predator adaptations, but the ones they do have are pretty cool. One is just their slimy skin. They produce a lot of mucus on this damp skin, which makes them slippery and difficult to grasp. Some salamanders are better able to camouflage to avoid being noticed, but others are very brightly colored. And some are colored in this way as a warning. Some have poison glands that are toxic or produce an icky taste. But others mimic more toxic species. For example, this red salamander mimicking an eastern newt, which is very toxic. Red salamander less so. Newts in particular produce toxins and are very brightly colored, usually this orangey color, to warn others. Taricha newts, like these California newts, produce the toxin tetrodotoxin. This is the same toxin that pufferfish carry. It's a very potent neurotoxin. And what it does is it acts as a sodium channel blocker. So this means it inhibits the firing of action potentials in neurons, which in turn will prevent the nervous system from carrying messages out to different parts of the body. When ingested, tetrodotoxin can cause paralysis of the diaphragm, which can result in death due to respiratory failure, but it can also produce things like drooling, sweating, facial numbness, fixed and dilated pupils, etc. The only predator of these Trisha newts, the rough-skinned newt and the California newt, are garter snakes, some of which have developed a resistance to tetrodotoxin. And the two are in somewhat of an evolutionary arms race, where the newts are consistently becoming more and more toxic, and the garter snakes develop stronger resistance over the course of multiple generations. Regardless of whether or not they possess poison glands, all salamanders are capable of regeneration of their limbs. In fact, they routinely regenerate not only their tails and other limbs, but complex tissues, including organs, as well as their lens or their retina, their eye. And this is of great interest to many medical researchers, particularly axolotls have generally been used in these types of studies where they've been genetically engineered so that they'll fluoresce. They have a protein that is present in cells in the limbs in particular, allowing researchers to track cell division as they regenerate. What they found is that salamander tissues contain cells that differentiate very slowly, weakly, or not at all, which gives them these regenerative properties. Some researchers have described them as walking bags of stem cells. Um, so when they are wounded, all these cells will form this blastema and go through this process of differentiating into the lost parts of the limb that are needed to regenerate. In addition to being important in medical research, many salamanders also have cultural significance. In particular, a lot of European and Asian myths and legends about salamanders are directly tied to the element of fire. It was thought they were born of fire because they were often observed crawling out of logs that had been thrown into the fire, likely because they were living in those logs and trying to escape the fire from which they were thrown into. But it was thought that they were born of this fire. Chinese giant salamanders are hunted for meat, but also used in traditional Chinese medicine, and are thought to have a lot of different benefits, including nourishing the blood, benefiting wisdom, um, etc. Cherokee wisdom says don't drink the water unless it's run over a salamander's back, uh, which is pretty sound advice considering they are amphibians and they're sensitive to contaminated water and pollution. But probably most culturally significant is the axolotl. They're extremely important in Aztec and as well as modern day Mexican culture. The species itself is named after the Aztec deity, Bolotl, the god of fire and lightning. And in general, not just axolotls, but also tiger salamanders are pretty popular as pets, as well as ambassador animals. There are 7 different species that can be found in Wisconsin. That these include the common mud puppy, the eastern red-backed salamander, the four-toed salamander, the blue-spotted salamander, the tiger salamander, the spotted salamander, and the eastern newt. Around here, you're most likely to see a blue-spotted salamander or a tiger salamander, though not in our parks. One species, the four-toed salamander, is of special concern in Wisconsin. These salamanders like very specific microhabitats. They really like dense moss, or moss that's on down woody debris, that overhangs water. Or they also really like sedge tussock wetlands. Um, and their preference for these microhabitats likely limits their abundance. And many salamanders all over the world are facing different conservation threats. In particular, like frogs and toads, salamanders are quite sensitive to pollution and poor water quality because of their permeable skin. In addition, habitat fragmentation and habitat loss more generally are also major threats because a lot of salamanders return to their natal streams. Road crossings can become a major barrier and cause a lot of mortality during their breeding season. But infectious disease is probably among the largest concern um, for salamanders at this time. The fungal disease, chytrid, chytridiomycosis, has been responsible for major population declines, particularly in frogs. Um, The different species, more commonly known as BD or BSAL, are aquatic fungi that cause significant skin disease in amphibians. An infection with chytrid results in the degradation of the keratin layer of an amphibian skin, which leads to skin sloughing, lethargy, weight loss, and potentially death, which is likely due to the disruption in fluid transport and or gas exchange that's happening by the skin. BD has spread worldwide and is known to infect over 500 species of amphibians, including some salamanders. And it's caused very significant declines in some species, in the US, particularly the Western US. B-Sal, on the other hand, has been restricted to Asia and Europe. But the risk of introducing B-Sal into the US is very high, due to the international pet trade and the high contagiousness of this pathogen. And with such a highly diverse salamander community within the US, introduction of this pathogen could have devastating effects, as it has in Europe in particular. Another pathogen of concern to amphibians is ranaviruses. Recent evidence suggests that the virus originated in fish hosts, but underwent several host shifts, and is now causing mass die-offs in both larval and adult amphibians. In amphibians, clinical signs include abnormal behavior and swimming, lethargy, swelling of the limbs or body, fluid accumulation, skin hemorrhage, as well as sometimes skin ulcers. Studies suggest that changing global temperatures may be responsible for the increased proliferation of both chytridiomycosis and ranaviruses, as well as the introduction of non-native species. And while salamanders are facing a lot of different threats, not all is bad. In particular, the eastern hellbender, while it's still endangered, has reached many milestones thanks to conservation efforts in captive breeding. In 2022, the St. Louis Zoo and Missouri Department of Conservation released their 10,000th hellbender that had been zoo raised into the wild. And in 2023, they found two zoo raised hellbenders guarding viable clutches of eggs out in one of the rivers that they had been released into. And closer to home, Mequon Nature Preserve has seen some success in reintroducing tiger salamanders. And as we work to manage and restore the land, maybe someday soon you'll see salamanders out in the UEC parks. And so we'll end there, and I'll take any questions.